projects in LA and also on the East Coast, bringing back projects to New York and so on, with a lot of partner institutions interested in exploring the same type of avenues we were working on. Big mix of people over there, really from hardcore scientists to complete artists not connected at all to art and technology, and we somehow made it work over several years, developing a lot of interesting projects, really straddling the disciplines. Over there, so for me, what I developed there is I tapped a lot in the San Francisco design scene, where you find also a lot of local Swiss heroes like Yves Béard, the well-known San Francisco-based designer, originally from Switzerland. We did a lot of projects investigating these links between design and technology, hosting several big fairs and events around design, working also, for example, here with the Architecture Center in New York on presenting solar cells designs developed at EPFL already. A lot of basically Swiss university projects, but interdisciplinary, brought over to the United States. Worked a lot also on sort of classical branches of design, but with a technological twist, so investigating, for example, typography, but really taking the digital typography aspects of it. It was sort of fun to do these types of events because you got people like Donald Knuth, the legend of digital typeface programming, showing up at our events dressed in traditional Swiss garbs and so on. So it was sort of a good reception always. We worked a lot with designers also in terms of installation programs, technological or not. We worked in our own spaces. We did projects at Burning Man and so on with different interfaces where the technological aspect was as much in construction strategies, material uses, and uses also of digital flows of information flowing into these structures. And we worked a lot with gaming and game design. That's become a really interesting area of art and technology development in Switzerland. We have a pretty thriving gaming scene that is also academically linked. The Zurich University for the Arts, for example, had one of the first game design programs in Europe. So we worked a lot with them on pushing really gaming designers in an artistic sense, promoting them also in a startup sense, really trying to find business connections for them in California, and also connecting them to other fields, typically gaming applied to the medical domain, rehab strategies, and so on. We worked also on exhibitions that are really focused on identifying maybe common aesthetic investigations in the arts and in science, typically, for example, doing shows around neuroscientific imagery, showing how visualization strategies for brain patterns, brain circuits, had relationships with the arts and what type of aesthetic decisions and aesthetic selections were made in these types of combinations. And then, of course, we worked also with a lot of contemporary artists exploring art and technology interfaces. Zimoun is one of them. I think he will do a show here fairly soon, I think in connection also with the Biennale and with the program that Paul Witzer will be running here. So we did his first solo show in the US with the local media art gallery in 2010, 2011. We worked a lot on sound performances also. Maybe some of you saw the installation by Juan at Máquina Galleria the other night. Typically these sort of shaking structures through sound, that's a theme we explored quite a lot with Swiss electronic musicians and Californian partners. Here this duo, sometimes trio, called Infrasound, which really sort of plays buildings, plays one space only one time, and really instead of doing a performance based on fixed songs or fixed sounds, really tunes the building and then tries to sort of shake it in specific ways through the performances. This was something that was really interesting for us. We worked also a lot, and again also with Swiss academic partners, on these notions of defining spaces through sound. We did this exhibition called Milieu Sonore with the Zurich University of the Arts and the Institute of Computer Music and Sound Technologies there, which was all about sort of investigating the role that sound plays in the definition of virtual spaces which is more and more a notion, and this was sort of before VR got to be as big a topic as it is today. It's just a few years prior. And then all the questions around sort of bringing back these virtual spaces into physical galleries and so on, all the challenges there between sort of the real and the analog and the virtual and digital sort of sound spaces. So typically these projects, they had an academic background, and at the same time they featured pinpoint interventions by people really associated to the contemporary art scene in Switzerland, like Yves Netzhammer, for example, who represented Switzerland at the Venice Biennale also already back in 2003, who here was really part of this project and really brought his own specific aesthetics to these types of projects. We also extended all these investigations into sounds in projects like this one, the Markus Meder Trees project we did in 2012, which was really about sort of investigating full and natural environments. For example, here the ecosystems of Californian redwood forests, and really seeing if through sonification of the natural data we could extract from these forests, we could actually build a coherent ecosystem only represented through sound, and by doing this helping maybe the scientists find out patterns in the natural environments they were studying that wouldn't necessarily appear in their raw statistics they would normally extract from their work, etc. So this is a type of topic that really this sort of data conversion from the natural to the digital and back, that we were really interested in the projects we were developing there. And all of these, of course, if any of this catches your attention, I'm happy to discuss it then later also with you. And several of you already mentioned to me that they were very well aware of this Artists in Labs residency program, also developed by the Zurich University of the Arts. It was one of the pioneering art residency programs in science institutions, developed in Switzerland for over 10 years now. We had the pleasure of working with them several times and also do retrospective exhibitions of the work that happened there. For example, we did this exhibition with the San Francisco Art Institute and Wuhan Ru over there in 2011 and 10. Very interesting program in terms of just setting sort of basic analysis of how potential art-science relationships could work, what type of definition of the common work is necessary, what type of coaching is needed when you bring an artist into science, office politics, and so on. It's still a program we're very interested in, and that also inspires part of what we do now at EPFL in the Art Lab project. So then in early 2013, I moved back to Switzerland and went to work on this beautiful campus by Lake Geneva. Pretty nice setup to work in. And over there, what we did is they basically asked me to come and join them because they wanted to develop their own art and technology projects with a specific focus on extracting the most out of competencies that were in the school. So not so much about sort of inviting artists over and then sort of creating a blend with science, but more sort of developing transdisciplinarity within the school itself. And then they asked me to come over to help generate that a little bit, and also to develop a public platform for these projects, so that not only could we do the interface between artists and scientists and create transdisciplinary projects, but that we would also have spaces where we could exhibit some of the results and really have this sort of pressure of delivering public programs on the site itself that would not be finished exhibitions, but sort of also parts of a research project, basically part of a research process. So we created this building that we now call Art Lab, and we created it with this Japanese architect, Kengo Kuma, who's been building, obviously in Japan, he's one of the big ones, building the new Olympic Stadium for the Olympics in Tokyo in 2020, and so on. And this was one of the first projects he did in Europe. He's getting more and more busy now on the continent, but this Art Lab building was his first big cultural project in Europe, and of course also in Switzerland. What we did with Kuma was develop this very open-ended public building that is accessible not only to an audience of specialists incorporated in the campus, but really open to anyone interested in coming on campus and learning about what we do. And we created this sort of three-space building, all 3 spaces hosted under one common roof. The architectural project was long known as Under One Roof, maybe the name even subsisted in the program, I think, today. And really this sort of symbolic of this roof enabling us to host all supposedly different disciplines under one common shelter and develop common projects there. So just a few images of it. So it's very recent, and we just opened it. We opened the project and started our first contents in November of last year. So we're not even a year in the program, so which means that it's also still very fresh, and there's still a lot of opportunities that we haven't explored. But the building is a great tool for us. It's also a great place to really get our community to sort of come and maybe experience something that they don't have necessarily planned in their academic courses so far. So yeah, it's a pretty nice sort of platform to work with. What is included in there is these 3 spaces. So we really have, it's really based on specific projects that the school were developed, but that all share this commonality of being art technology interfaces, but they're pretty specific. So we have one space that is dedicated to the medium of music, in terms of music as a performance art, music as also a specifically recorded type of cultural archive. So we work a lot now with the Montreux Jazz Festival in Switzerland, big jazz festival, pretty famous worldwide. I'll come back on what exactly we do with them, but it's really all about sort of audiovisual archives and how you preserve them and how you exhibit them to different audiences. Then we have a center space that is dedicated more to what we can do with the visual arts. A big part is also working on existing cultural heritage, taking existing collections of different types of institutions and saying, what are the issues with preserving these collections? What are the issues with maybe organizing a digital version of these collections? And what are the issues with exhibiting these collections and all of the added digital flow of information you can now sort of add to them. And then a third space, which we call Data Square, which is more, has the logic of a small science museum and is dedicated to 2 specific big data projects that the school has developed over the last few years. One of them being really a cultural big data project. It's called Venice Time Machine, and it's an attempt to build a digital model of the city of Venice over a period of 1,000 years. I'll come back on that. And then in this pavilion, it is put in sort of mirror dialogue with a project that is really a biological big data project that we call the Blue Brain Project. Maybe some of you have heard of the parent European scale project of this called the Human Brain Project. And this is really an attempt to do a digital model, ultimately, of the human brain in its entire complexity, which is also something fairly new. And here we put these 2 projects together to say, even though the subjects are very different, the challenges they face in terms of dealing with harnessing, organizing, and then showing again huge masses of analog data are pretty similar, actually. So we'll come back on that also.
Luc?
Yes?
How did you arrive to these 3 big...
This segmentation,
yeah.
The original segmentation, honestly, has more to do with just sort of very specific history of these 3 projects, which were all born also of personal relations of the former president of the school, who said, we need to do something with this festival, and we need to do something with the city of Venice, etc. So it's very much sort of basically sort of coincidence that they all sort of came to birth basically around the same time. Then my job was really to sort of say, okay, what are the commonalities of these projects? What are the common challenges, whether you're dealing with the archive of a festival, whether you're dealing with the collection of a museum, or whether you're dealing with the memory of an entire city? What are the common challenges there, and how can we answer that, or at least, or ask more questions with what we have in the school? And typically to continue on that path, what is the sort of coherence of all of this? What we consider that we are doing is, regardless of the type of cultural heritage that we deal with, there is a certain commonality and a certain software chain that you sort of work along, basically. in all cases, you generally start with a mass of analog data preserved in various sort of recipients, be it any format of analog tape since the late 60s for the archives of the Montreux Jazz Festival, be it any type of physical artifact in art collections, or be it the full archive of a city. And you always go through these phases of first raw digitization processes. How can you make the digital copy of that original manuscript Venetian, or how can you make the best possible copy of that Egyptian statue, for example, or how do you scan this one abstract painting from the 60s, etc. All of these types of questions, which are really about format conversions, basic storage questions, etc., and which generally lead you to have maybe a first copy, but not an activable one. And it's not a connected one. So that the second phase is really important for us to also have laboratories and researchers dedicated to organizing digital data, to really not have simply single items that are copied and then basically just put one next to the other without any connection, but to really turn them into a functional network of information. And this, of course, is done by organizing the metadata related to this information so that you have connected corpuses again. And by doing this, of course, this is the phase where you bring back in the specialists who already know the content, and you say, look, if you work with us on defining how we can arrange this, you will have much more powerful research tools at your hand. And this is also the opportunity of suddenly bringing this mass of information that was so far reserved to specialists to bring it to a much wider audience by giving them access to certain narratives and maybe also enabling them to develop their own scenarios of navigation through the corpuses. And then the last phase, of course, is, and also because we have these physical spaces, then there is always the test of saying, okay, you have all of this mass of physical analog artifacts that people still want to see. People go to museums more than ever before, etc. But of course, they're encountering artworks in limited physical spaces. So there is an opportunity now to bring more information to the surface. How do you do that? How do you keep a balance between showing the existing artifacts and showing this additional data flow with it, without having every exhibition today degenerate into some sort of iPad circus where you just walk through an exhibition looking at a tablet, and every 15 minutes you look up and you say, oh yes, this is a Rothko on the wall or something like that. So this is important for us. And of course then this last part, there you are talking to laboratories and specialists that are maybe more, again, on the design end of things. UX designers, UI designers, etc., really working on the ergonomics of the experience. What is it concretely to have all of this culture and information at the tip of your fingers, basically? What is it going to be? What are going to be the representation strategies of that content? And that's where also, of course, a lot of components such as immersive narratives come in, AR, VR, and so on. So it's really sort of along that chain is really, we find a lot of very specific competencies in the school, most of which existed before we started that project, but we try and bring them and say, hey, come and work on the cultural field with us. It's going to take you out of your comfort zone maybe, but a lot of your technologies have an application in this field. And then ultimately what we try and do with this is also because there is this pull towards cultural topics and cultural materials of study. For us, it's also an opportunity to really say we have to develop this at the core and really make the labs themselves into more transdisciplinary structures. So a lot of focus in the last 3-4 years for us has been to develop what is known as the digital humanities, so really humanities plus computers, regardless of the field, on the campus. So from one digital humanities professor 4 years ago, now we have 5 working either on sort of music and computing, analyzing musical notation as basically code. We have people who specialize in these Venetian archives that bring a lot of competencies in art history, as well as in artificial intelligence and so on. We just hired a new professor who is actually also my new boss, really specialized in experimental museology. and museographic technologies, which is going to be a really interesting avenue of collaboration for us. And of course, with all these new research and teaching capabilities coming into school, we also intend to develop new transdisciplinary profiles among our students, so that we don't have these sort of very sort of mono-block engineers coming out of the school and who you have to force to come and work on culture because they think it's not their field, etc. I really want to have students who, from their first year, understand that culture is not just something that they can enjoy in their hobby time. It's really something they can have an active part in, whether it's technical or also critical, or hopefully the two at the same time, basically. And then we have, oh yeah, I left this in French in the middle, sorry, but then we have the building itself really acting as this sort of accelerator, because we have to deliver a public program, so we have to tell the labs we work with, yes, you're going to go through your long research cycles, but we have this calendar date, we want to present your work, so you have to think now about also solutions to show your work. And this often is going to push them to work with other labs more specialized in this last part, exhibition, representation end of the programs. And at the same time also, we really intend this middle space, this art lab, to really be a middle space that is not really here to be a museum on campus, in the sense of a museum that would show finished exhibition projects or even products. It's really, for us, it's still, this building is still a part of a research infrastructure. It's a public extension of that research infrastructure, and it's there still to test things. So we do exhibitions, and we hope, you know, that they're good enough to draw in an audience, but that audience has to be aware that these exhibitions are still a work in progress. So they might come in on one day, and one of the labs has decided that their solution to exhibit this or that content just doesn't work within this or that parameter, and they might be fixing something, and you just visit, and you know, you can talk with the scientists, and they say, well, we're changing this because of that, etc. And we want to make that process and that conversation really part of what the building has to offer. And then also, why we do that is, of course, that we want to be of support to more classic cultural institutions who all know that they have to do more with the digital, etc. And you go to museums today, and maybe there is one guy generally in the communications department who say, yeah, we really must do more, etc. And okay, they will set up social media accounts, etc. And then they will go work on the actual content of the museum and say, okay, we really need to get an exhibition where we do something with VR within the next year, etc. But very often, it's getting better, but there's still a little bit of that sort of panicky impulse to absolutely have to do something, generally with limited means, maybe with one sponsor who says, I have a lot of money and I want to do something with you very quick. And so it's often these sort of segmented and urgent type of reasonings that don't really base themselves on a sort of more long-term research. And this is normal. Most of these museums, they don't have the budgets to do this type of long-term research. They don't have it necessarily as a priority. They might even be afraid of it in a way, because they take a risk and they say, maybe if we go too technological, part of our audience, our ticket-paying audience, will say, no, I won't come anymore, etc. This is not of interest to me, etc. So we really say, okay, we take part of that risk for you, because we are a research institution at our essence. So in this field also, we will experiment. We're good at finding money also to do research, and we will do it in this field. What we think sticks in our exhibition programs, whether it's one very specific module in an exhibition, whether it's one specific theme, and so on, we can later work with you on coming to sort of scale it up to your programs, basically. We hope that when we do this transition to the external and the public world of basically of the cultural market, that some of our researchers, whether they're our professors or whether they're our students who worked with us on the first modules that we show in Art Lab, that they say, hey, actually this museum is interested in what I do, this auction house has also showed interest, maybe there's enough demand, there's enough critical mass that I start a business with this. And so then we really take the sort of tech transfer infrastructure of the school and also start feeding transdisciplinary culture technology profiles within that sort of pipeline. So this is very important for us. Any questions on this?
Yeah. Is there any link between this infrastructure and the space in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley?
There is, yeah, there's a lot. So basically, the two institutions, EPFL and the one in San Francisco, SwissNext, they're funded by the same governmental organization. Pretty much the core money comes from the same place. And the place in San Francisco is there to be an academic promotion platform. So we already have 2 or 3 now common exhibition projects with them, where they say, this is a project of EPFL, we bring it to the US, we show it with partners. But then also, the underlying reasoning is that they take the specific lab components and they tell them, you should go and talk to Apple, to Facebook, to whoever that would be interested in part of your technologies there. Yeah, that's definitely it. There's a strong connection. Any more questions on this, or I continue? So just to go through, again, the 3 spaces. So first this Montreux Jazz digital project that is also actually for the building. It also has the function of being a cafe, etc. This is less interesting for you guys, but if you come and visit, you'll see that it's just a nice place once you have gone through the building, that you can sit down and process things with a coffee or a beer or 3 beers and sort of stay there. So of course it has this function, you know, of the cultural hotspot on campus. But mostly it's really there for us to try and work on representation strategies of the digitized archive of the festival. What is very special with this festival, Montreux, so it started in 1967, and from the start, from that first year, they filmed and recorded literally every single concert that happened there. So it started fairly small, maybe the first years you had like 10 concerts or something like this, and now for the past at least 25 years or so, it's really 2 weeks of festival with about probably 10 concerts a night, etc. So over time, it's really built into this massive, massive archive. You have 50 years of concerts. You have, today it's more than, I don't know, I think it's about 10,000 hours of audio, 10,000 hours of video, etc. Everything really preserved in the highest quality possible. So all of the audio, we have all of the mixing desk recordings, TV, we have all of the single feeds for every single camera, and so on. So it's really a massive, massive archive. And if you look at sort of other music festivals or similar cultural institutions, nobody did this type of job as thoroughly documented. If you look at typically, the festival now has a lot of different music styles, whatever, there's plenty of pop acts, etc., etc. But if you look back, for example, at the early days in the early 70s, when they really had a very jazz and soul music focused program, if you look at what exists in the US at the same time, from jazz clubs, from festivals, there's almost nothing, basically, in terms of recordings. Maybe some of you have seen this documentary about Nina Simone that came out 2-3 years ago, won an Oscar, best documentary, etc. 2/3 of the live footage in there is from Montreux, because there's just almost nothing else that was filmed in jazz clubs in the US and so on. So it's really a very, very important archive. And with the archive comes, of course, a lot of additional documentation. So the festival is the brainchild of this guy on the left, who spent years building his network, corresponding with artists, etc. So you have all of this written archive that accompanies the audiovisual one, contracts, letters, etc. You have specific musical histories. A guy like Miles Davis came about 5 times in the early 70s when he was in this crazy electric fusion period and so on. Then he stopped playing, and when he came back in the 80s, he came again almost every year to Montreux. So you can also follow individual or very specific musical evolutions through this archive in a pretty detailed manner, actually. So this is all stuff that we have to sort of deal with. There's a visual history, of course, with the festival, of course, very reflective of the changing times. a lot of contributions. You have Jean Tinguely, who did several of the posters for the festival, who created a logo for the festival as well. You had, so it's also, the festival was always a reflection also of some of the contemporary art exchanges between Switzerland, or that part of Switzerland, and the rest of the world. Keith Haring did posters for the festival, Andy Warhol was a guest, David Bowie played at the festival and did a poster for it, etc. So you have all of these connected materials that we have to deal with. And so we built several spaces within that pavilion that we have to really bring all this content to the fore again. So to do that, you have to work on, and it's fairly limited actually, physical spaces, but you have to work on how you can make these spaces as big as possible, how you can work on projection technologies, what type of screen you use, etc. How can you make the neighboring surfaces part of what hosts the image? How can you make these same surfaces the channel for metadata linked to the concerts, etc. And then you have to work also on the interfaces. How must it feel to have all of this archive again at the tip of your fingers? How can you manipulate it? How can you choose elements? What are the channels of research that are offered to a general public, and so on. And of course, we also work a lot on sound broadcast technologies, because we have these extremely high quality recordings of the festival, often instrument by instrument. We also work, for example, on not only building a room to broadcast them, but building a room in which we can broadcast them and give you the feeling that you are in the actual space where it happened, by basically taking architectural records of the spaces, making an analysis of the materials in the concert venues, and then by using ambisonics and other 3D sound technologies, saying, okay, we're going to parameter the raw information, put it through the black box of the digital black box of a specific concert venue, and make it sound like it was back then. Then, of course, you can also do crazy experiments. You can take an Aretha Franklin concert from '71 and say, okay, I will make it sound like she's playing in the biggest venue we have in 2017, and so on. But, and these are all fields that are interesting related to that archive, but that, of course, have much bigger impacts. You know, sound design in architecture is becoming more and more prevalent, so all that we learn here, we hope that our labs can then apply it to other areas of research, or even, again, you know, go out and do a business with part of this. And also, this was a very interesting also, we keep on digitizing this, the material. Today we are finished basically with what exists. We have a digital copy of all the 50 years of the festival. Every year we do one more edition. We basically digitize it live. As the concerts happen, we are digitizing it. But then the whole storage issue itself is also an interesting one. This is not solved, because of course you choose one digital format at one specific time, and you say, okay, now we're going to focus on bringing everything into that one format, and this is going to be our reference for normally not that long, because these formats change very quickly. If somebody higher up in the broadcast chain, whether it's YouTube or whatever type of broadcast platform, says, we're going to change our API, maybe you're screwed, maybe your thing is unreadable, etc., etc. So there's also a lot of discussion about what type of stable storage means you can have over time. And one interesting thing we did is we did this partnership with this DNA analysis company based in San Francisco called Twist Bioscience, who has now made a storage of 2 tracks extracted from the archives into DNA. So, which is very sort of weird as a process, but it's really sort of, it was interesting to read through these articles actually, you basically have to convert your binary information, the digital recordings of the concerts, and translate it into DNA languages, so into DNA sequencing. And you can actually, once you do that, you can really use sort of cells basically as digital storage information repositories. It's pretty crazy. I don't know how exactly the details of it work, but basically there's an opportunity there to have storage apparatuses that are much more stable because they're natural and they're actually easily adaptable also. much more stable, much more long-term use than sort of the current digital formats. And also in terms of storage space, it's really just coding these two songs. It's the equivalent of whatever, a sort of microscopic grain of sand, basically. And so the whole archive, if you were to then digitize it again, you would probably have the entire history of the festival in maybe, a box like this, something like that. Whereas the same physical storage spaces you still need when you're storing this in regular terabytes, petabytes, and so on, it's still a pretty massive facility that consumes a lot of energy, etc., etc. So this is going to be also a very interesting avenue of research in years to come, not only for this archive, but of course also for a lot of different types of contents. Any questions about this? All good. So then I go to a second space in the building. This is more the sort of mini science museum one, dedicated to two big data projects. Blue Brain project, digital model of the brain, Venice Time Machine, digital model of the city of Venice over a period of 1,000 years. We wanted to present them together because we think they're coherent with the whole sort of digital culture aspect of the project as a whole, and because they share these challenges in relationship to data. Whether you want to code all of the research done around the brain, or whether you want to code the entire history of a city, you have to start with a mass of analog data where you have to say, how can I digitize this? How do I make the digital format? How much time is it going to take me? What sort of tools do I have to use, etc. And then again, you only have this amorphous mass once you have done the raw digitization. So how do you make it into something that is organized, that is activable, that is searchable, and so on? And once you have that dense model, how do you then bring it back to an audience? How do I travel through these brain connections? How do I travel through this Venice at any sort of point in time? So this is important for us. And maybe less interesting, but we also use the same space to also examine the school itself, EPFL, and say, hey, this is also actually a complicated place. It's a lot of students, a lot of staff, a lot of departments. Can we also use big data strategies and data visualization strategies to explain the school better? So this is just a sort of small thing we did. Typically, I don't know if this starts or not. Should. Typically, just doing this was working on our student population, typically taking all of our students and turning them into simple digital dots. These are just sort of just a couple project drafts, basically, and sort of just shifting these 10,000 and some dots among different visual representations of where they integrate, what sort of faculty they're in, what sort of age balance they're in, and so on, the origins of the students, and so on. So it's just a few small sort of things that we did, etc. The logo of the school with the same 10,000 points, and so on. We looked at, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'll just show you the visuals, because it's interesting that out of statistics of the school, you again come in these modes of representations that have to do, again, with these sort of almost data psychedelics that you also find in, for example, the work of Norimichi that you maybe saw the other night, and Nave, or something like that. So I'll just skip the rest here, and maybe I will show you, okay, this is still the same thing. Skip this.
Le passé.
Voilà. I'm just going to show you now a few videos about that Venice project, which I think is pretty key to all of what we do. There's a lot of French being spoken, there's a bit of Italian too, and the subtitles are in French, but if you don't get it, we can play it again, or whatever. Sorry. Back.
Le passé est encore quasiment un territoire vierge. L'essentiel du matériel historique n'a pas encore été esploré.
L'impatto del big data nella storiografia è un impatto importantissimo. La storia, almeno quella dei grandi flussi, è ancora da scrivere.
The importance of physical archives is that they've been assembled over many years, but unless they're digitized, they effectively gradually become obsolete.
The Venetian state archives are the biggest in the Mediterranean area, not only, but the Venetian state administration was extremely sophisticated. So we have this immense database, but it needs to be exploited, it needs to be made operational.
Pour expliquer l'anatomie de la Venice Time Machine, nous pouvons la découper en plusieurs étapes. La première étape, c'est la numérisation des documents eux-mêmes, donc transformer des objets physiques en images. La seconde étape, c'est transformer ces images en un réseau d'informations. Ceci, il faut les lire, les découper, trouver où se situe l'information dans les cartes, dans les tableaux, dans les documents, et construire petit à petit un très grand graphe. La dernière étape du processus, c'est transformer ce grand graphe en une simulation du passé.
Cosa succederà quando riusciremo a strutturare tutti I dati? Ecco, non credo che nessuno può dire per il momento che cosa succederà. Io sono sicura che entro 20 anni, entro una generazione, I storici che verranno dopo di noi, ecco, saranno molto diversi anche proprio del metodo di lavoro.
La Venice Time Machine è un progetto importante non solo perché si ricostruisce potenzialmente la storia di una città, ma è importante perché rappresenta attraverso la sua metodologia la democratizzazione dei dati storici per tutti.
L'historien va être équipé d'outils absolument novateurs, qui vont lui donner comme des super pouvoirs la capacité de chercher dans des millions de documents, alors que précédemment, il était limité à quelques dizaines. Pendant le siècle précédent, on pensait que la frontière, c'était l'espace, c'était les espaces extrêmement lointains. Il est possible que la frontière de demain, en tout cas la frontière du 21e siècle, ce soit en fait le passé.
So I don't know if you got it all. I hope it translates pretty well over to Spanish, Italian and French parts here. But so again, sort of all these basic components here. You have a process that you have to follow that is again really digitization, organization, and then everything that's representation of this mass of connected information. You have the fact also of this sort of thing that's very important for us in all these projects is sort of like CERN takes the infinitely small, and like ALMA, for example, takes the infinitely big in space, we say, well, maybe one of these other vast domains of research, equally vast, is the past, and all that's so far undocumented in there. That's very key for us. And basically the way we go about this is to say, okay, you know, in our current times, almost everything is automatically digitized, you know, because it's me walking through the Biennale and taking photos and putting them to my Instagram, and even, whoops, sorry, I just missed it. Launch this, sorry about that. Or even a lot of also, of course, non-voluntary recording of data. Your phone shaking in your pocket is probably sending some sort of movement data to a Google or a Facebook that will do a psychological profile analysis of you by how many times you shake your phone a day, etc., things like this. So there is just pretty much everything is digitized, and the more you go back in the past, of course, you have to work on acquiring analog materials and putting them in your digital model, and the more you have, the more you will then be able to go to that last part, which is simulation, basically. You will never have all of the content, but the denser your model is, the more you can make precise extrapolations and figure out what's going on with what you don't know yet. And again, just this, so really the physical challenge in this Venice project is very present. That's the main material we work with there, and that's the State Archive of Venice. It was the first, the Venetians were really the first to do a very organized way of classifying archival information in Europe. They did it because, of course, they were very dependent on the traffic going on in the city, with the sea, but also with everything north of them in Europe. And they just wanted also for tax reasons just to have everything documented thoroughly. And by doing so, they really developed a lot of the principles of classification of information that were then adopted in all of the Western world. So it's really sort of the grandmother of all archives, basically, which makes it even more interesting for us then, because we're really working with this original database in a way. And of course, in terms of a physical scanning challenge, it's pretty massive. You won't find everything you need to build a Venetian model in that administrative archive that we saw before, these 80 kilometers of administration manuscripts. You also have to go and look, for example, at the artistic production around the city. So we work with the Cini Foundation on basically digitizing all of the records of Venetian artworks. The Cini Foundation is the biggest database of these artworks. They have about 1.5 million paintings and other descriptions, artistic descriptions of Venice stored in their files, classical art history types of files. If you do a Google search adopting the same types of criteria to make emerge what you would find in this archive, you would find maybe 300,000 items. So they have a lot again in there that is simply not digitized yet and that you have to go and extract. And so to make this process as efficient as possible, you also have to develop scanning forms that are adapted to the materials. Typically, for example, So we developed these rotating scanner machines with a company called Factum Arte, based in Madrid, who work a lot on digitizing cultural heritage, that make it easier for us to go through these art history records and scan them as fast as possible, basically, and sort of go through a non-stop rotating chain of documents throughout the day, and even making it actually a little bit more playful for the staff that still have so far to go through this manually. We're trying to reduce this, of course, trying to reduce the number of people we have to sort of use to do this. That's a sort of fun process for us. And then in the administrative archive, you're basically still working with these classical scanners. So you have these big manuscripts. You open them 2 pages by 2 pages. You lay them flat, and you scan 2 pages, and you go on like this. But there's 80 kilometers of the stuff. So if you have one scanner and one person doing this one strategy the whole time, all of us will be dead by the time this is completed. So of course you have to think, okay, this being the current state of technology, how many of these machines can we have? How can we sort of maximize that type of scanning production? But also then we have to think, okay, what other technological inspirations we could bring in the project to make this happen also in a different way. So one thing there that we are doing is also taking inspiration from the colleagues working in neuroscience, and saying actually some of the brain scan techniques maybe could be applied also to the book material. So typically the MRI, the brain scan, it has a way of functioning also in, let me see if this starts. Basically you take a brain and shoot rays through it. You can do the same type of process with a book, a closed book, and you're going to shoot your rays through it, and the rays are going to differentiate within this mass, because in this mass you find a raw page, just paper, and you find a lot of parts of it where people have written on, and they have generally written, in the case of this old archive, it's all written in ink. The ink contains metal residues that then generate basically a different bounce length of your rays. So you scan this sort of sandwich here, and this informous mass, basically it's going to start to show basically graphic signs, sort of like the height levels on the maps or something, just sort of these abstract graphical shapes. And then once you have done this, you're going to be able to start cutting down your volume down again to the page level. The software doing this, on the page you will only see abstract graphical shapes, but then you bring in the next software in line who is going to start to read this content and really make sense of it, basically. So this is interesting for us because, of course, in terms of gains of time, just dealing with this huge massive archive, it's going to be a massive gain. And of course, also the other element is to avoid deteriorating the original materials too much. all of this archive. It's been regrouped in one single place in Venice by the Austrians in the early 19th century. It's not a great storage space, actually. It's too humid, it's too warm, etc., etc. But the material, the manuscripts have gotten so used to it that you basically cannot take them out again. And even just sort of taking out them off the shelves, sometimes it represents a risk. So the less we have to manipulate them, the less we have to open them, etc., the better it is for them. And then there is all of that material that you will find in there. You find, for example, all of these maps that again contain a lot of handwritten information, all of these weird shapes, etc. So all of this, of course, is a challenge for a machine to read. So for all of these types of documents, you have to develop technologies of reading, identifying written characters, identifying specific sort of structuring blocks of a city and saying, okay, yes, I recognize this shape, I have seen it in another document, I can compare these two documents, I can compare the same type of documents in two different periods of time, etc. So all of this, not going into the details now, it's just really complex, and you have to apply this to all of the maps you find, you have to apply this to all of the pure text documents you have, all of it is really key. And so on. Then the thing is that the more you scan these documents, the more you're able to read them. Venice is a city that has not suffered any major destruction. So it has had many different masters, but everybody basically just kept on adding or modifying to the city, but there's been no massive destruction. So there's no sort of ground zero from which the city was built from the ground up again, which means that you have a lot of places, or even just sort of simply GPS points in the city that exist from one period to the other. And through comparing documents across periods, you're going to take these points as anchors on which you can then build your model and your time machine, this sort of circulation in time. And ultimately, the goal, if you will, is to really have this, oops, sorry. Again, very good at this today, is that you say, okay, I have this city over 1,000 years, I have it documented in a number of possible formats, and from all of, sorry again, definitely, I have it documented in all types of formats from all periods, and all of them I can actually build them in the same model by using these types of referencing points we saw before, and say, for example, for this area, the plaza right next to the Rialto Bridge, so this is of course one of the most documented parts of Venice. Every day there's thousands of people shooting photos of that area, etc. So you can take one of these digital photographies of 2016 and say, okay, within that photo there's a lot of physical points that exist through the ages, and I can convert them in, I can take these points, say, okay, digital points, cloud points, and I will start shooting these points across documents to find the identities, basically, of the spaces. So for example here, start with this, we convert it into cloud point model of the same period, and we go and look, for example, in that visual archive of the Cini Foundation, we say, okay, here's a painting of exactly the same place, let's turn this into the architectural model at the same time. We go back to 16 again on the 3D, and now let's switch to the administrative documents, cadastral plan. On this cadastral plan, you find numbers associated to the businesses that were on the bridge, for example. Then you go look at the business records in the archive, you'll find these numbers, you'll find the guy who owned the shop. You go look in the family records, you'll find the family. You go back a generation, you see that the same family was already the owner of that same shop, that was approximately on the same position on the bridge, etc., etc. And you know, you do this as much as you can, basically navigating from one connected, digitized information bit to another, and then you start the same job again on the other side of the plaza, and so on. With the goal of basically saying, we want to have two things. We want to take one specific place in the city, and we want to travel as far back and as far forward in time for that specific place it must be as precise and dense a model as possible. And at the same time, we want to also be able to stay in one period of time and basically go for a walk in a city that's as complete as possible for that one period of time. So that's sort of the goal ultimately. Any questions on this? Good. If not, then I come to the third.
The information will be public.
This?
No, of the project.
Of the project, yes, actually. So far, they have an open development platform for this, which so far is still reserved to like specific science teams. But it's already people who are external to the project, but who we consider could be important in terms of adding metadata to the model that we don't have. And later on, we hope to really have also a public interface of this that's completely digital, where also a layman audience can come in and really walk into that Venice at any period of time. Now, it's too early because we don't have the density of the model yet. So also in terms of the third step, which is really representation of the model, so far, if we were to do, for example, a VR experience with this model, so far it would still be a sort of circus, basically. It would be, based on a few big chunks of data, and the rest would be just, Hollywood production, basically. So far we try to avoid it. We focus on the process, but it's going to come. And the goal for us to have it, to have the project done in open data and open science perspective is to, one, avoid these sort of copyright issues that typically cultural institutions have when they work with Google, for example, when you say, okay, great, Google is doing all my digitization, but then, oops, suddenly I can't use my own images, or suddenly I have a lawsuit because Google used an image of my painting here, and then the foundation of the artist family is suing the museum because they think it's me. So we try to avoid this and to really say, okay, we have a deal with the archives that everything we bring to the floor is public. And also, of course, so we hope that we can have as much external input as possible on the Venetian model, and that at the same time other cities or institutions can take the tools we used for Venice and apply them to another city, another environment, and say, okay, we can start building. For us, also today, there's a reasoning on a European scale, also because we're going after European-wide funding for this project, to say, okay, it could be, because Europe has this very densely documented history going pretty far back, that we could do something special for the continent there, and do some sort of European time machine to start with. And then it would be interesting, once this is solidified, to say, okay, what sort of historical records has, for example, a country like Chile? How far does it go back in terms of a contemporary way of archiving? What are the missing bits, etc.? And what ways, predating the current civilization, etc., what ways of documenting history were existing prior? So that's going to be pretty interesting too.
That could be like a great input for this Biennale, like the road, like earthquake after an earthquake.
Exactly.
What happens in this kind of data?
Yeah. What remains and so on. Yeah. Absolutely. Third space in the building, and again, I just take these spaces for sort of conversation starters for wider topics for us. So main gallery in the building, big, flexible gallery, 650 square meters to do visual arts related exhibitions, which can be focused on existing cultural heritage, let's say the production of one specific artist, but then where we can do the links with issues a museum faces with dealing with these collections and with exhibiting them. That's a big aspect of what we're doing in this space, and at the same time it's a space where sometimes we bring in contemporary productions, which probably can be of the sort of art science residency type of dialogue, or simply the product of artists who anyways make use of tools that are fairly similar to what you find on campus to produce an aesthetic and critical discourse about these same technologies. So it's a pretty nice tool to work with. It's pretty big. Maybe I'll skip this. I'll come back on this a tiny bit later. It's just a couple of slides on what my new boss does. I'll come back to this. And for us also, it's interesting. Basically, these links to sort of contemporary artistic production, they're not only in the field of, let's say, media art and so on, but you see also that there's a growing obsession with the archive in the contemporary art world. You saw it very clearly, for example, at the Venice Biennale in 2013, with this encyclopedic pavilion theme going through the pavilion, showing a lot of art brut related pieces also, where you really saw that the common denominator among all these art brut related productions was sort of this issue with dealing with too much data and this drive to represent the whole world in one single artistic item, typically this Japanese art brut related artist who always tries to paint all the trains from all the metro lines in Tokyo on one single piece of paper, and generally never manages because it starts too big and then he has to start squishing them in the bottom, etc. But this is typically this sort of issue with cultural data that we also encounter, and it's funny to see that it's very thematized in a lot of different ways. There's the issue, of course, also of like this accessibility of the archive that is really driving even new art museum architecture. You go to the new Louvre done by Sana in Lens in the northeast of France, and you have these big open windows showing you the storage facilities. So there's all this sort of sense of making an active part of the museum spectacle out of the archive. That's very interesting for us to sort of work on. And so these are all themes that, you know, exhibition by exhibition, we want to try and touch upon in this central space. The first show we did in here, we worked with, you probably know, these all black paintings. That's Pierre Soulages, the French sort of abstract expressionist artist who's now 93 and sort of the last standing monument of French post-war abstract painting, who in the late 70s started painting almost exclusively in this very intense black that he calls outre noir, beyond black, basically. And there the challenge for us was, I mean, it was interesting to get all this material in. We had 20 of his works to work with. And basically here we came with the question, and you'll see that again it relates to all of these phases of digitizing, organizing, showing. You have this guy who paints in all black, and we took the point, okay, maybe we will have an audience showing up here and saying, why did you just put 19 black squares on the wall? What is the meaning of this? It's the end of color, it's the end of light, there's no interest in there. But the artist himself has always said that his black is more complex than just sort of a single unit of color, and that its relationship also with light is crucial, that the paintings really come to life as you witness their interaction with ambient light, with exhibition light, and with the movement you generate as an audience, basically walking around these works. So we took these sort of topics and we said, okay, how can we have a look at this and illustrate or reveal even the complexity of the work without doing one of these science shows where we're going to take apart the paintings and sort of, you know, basically kill the work just to be able to do a scientific explanation of it. So it went through, so this was the exhibition. We did this also with a specific private partner who now we don't work with anymore, etc., and made it all a bit complicated in terms of preparing, but it was pretty interesting to do nonetheless. So typically we did a lot of stuff, maybe this I'm going to skip for now, sort of using virtual reality environments to do introductions to exhibitions rather than always going through blocks of texts and your themes. Can you bring a more sort of instinctive approach to exhibitions? But I'm going to skip, it's not the crucial part, I think, for me here. Let me see. This is more interesting. This is really sort of working with these abstract paintings as sources of complex analog data, and really looking at this black. Black is not really a single pigment. There's a lot of elements of color in there in the raw material, but it is not just detectable with, for example, our eyes or in normal camera, both functioning on RGB light divisions. So we said, how can we have a different pair of eyes look at like a Soulages painting? How can we have an eye that can make a more complex reading of these paintings? So we went to talk to one startup on the campus that develops hyperspectral cameras, which are cameras that are able to read and isolate all of the spectrums of light within the whole spectrum. So we read RGB, red, green, blue, but there's actually something like 52 strands of colors that can be identified, and these cameras are able to read them all. Today they're used mostly, actually, weirdly, in agriculture. They put them on drones and they fly over fields to basically make color mappings of fields and to say, basically look mostly at irrigation strategies. If it's dry, then the color will pop up differently and they sort of try to reroute, etc. Yep.
So here's a question. That machine is detecting just visible light, or is
It's
only electromagnetic?
It's a reflected light. It's visible, actually. Yeah.
It's just the visible
Yeah,
section.
yeah. Which is already sort of a pretty complex
complex,
information.
yeah.
But it's basically, then electromagnetism would be something else again that would be interesting to then investigate. But here we basically told these guys, hey, so they were busy with their farmers and stuff, and we told them, hey, come and work on a small side project with us, and you do a flyover of one of these soulage paintings. Like you fly over this and you give us the sort of pigmentation landscape of that object. So they did this, and then of course there's all these challenges of the data they give you. You can't show this to an audience. It's like these graphs, or complicated graphs, etc. So you also have to work on ways to bring it back in an exhibition setting. So working on data visualization strategies and so on. So this is sort of so the painting, the original painting is in the back, and we put this data version of the painting in front with a tool, a slider that would allow you to basically go through all the segments of color of the painting. So you have to work on finding a visualization that, again, instinctively relates to the painting and so on.
Par la décomposition de la lumière dans ses composantes fondamentales, on arrive à caractériser une couleur très finement. Et donc, on peut par exemple essayer de caractériser les pigments qui composent une œuvre, pas seulement une œuvre noire, mais toute l'œuvre d'art. On pourrait dire chaque élément de cette œuvre est composé de composantes spectrales particulières qui nous permettraient d'identifier très précisément. Le noir reflète en fait toute une série de composantes spectrales qui peut être très variées en fonction de l'exposition, de l'orientation du tableau. Donc c'est ça qu'on essaie de capturer ici.
L'idée, c'est pas seulement montrer des données scientifiques, mais de créer une émotion et que l'utilisateur puisse ressentir le flux lumineux couleur par couleur. On a vraiment joué avec des surfaces réfléchissantes pour vraiment représenter comment un soulage fonctionne. C'est vraiment, ça joue avec notre position, une lumière, une réflexion sur une surface. Donc c'était l'idée de représenter des petites particules qui reflètent la lumière différemment.
Voilà. Again, so this is it's a simple sort of test process of something we can do, but it's again really coming to these basics of how do you digitize an object like this? How through digitization can you extract more complex information about the proposed object? And then how do you structure this information and bring it back to an audience? So again, it's the same topics as with the concert archive, as with the Venetian city, and so on. Here, another project we also did in this show is that, okay, you have an artist that tells you that the main interest is of his works is the interplay with light, and then you basically show up in an exhibition and maybe you have a little bit of daytime lighting and it changes a little bit, but otherwise generally you have a fairly stable lighting, and one painting also, it doesn't move, it's hung in a certain way. So basically you already sort of, everything that's left is you moving a little bit and changing the light. The rest of the parameters, they're sort of set in an exhibition setting. So we said, okay, can we also sort of try to make them flexible again? We won't be able, because the paintings are pretty expensive, we won't be able to sort of shake them around the exhibition space, but can we again sort of bring a certain notion of movement to the light part? I'm just going to exit the presentation to get, don't look at my desktop too much. So this is what we did with also one laboratory really focused on signal transmission, coding, and one young team of interaction designers from the University of Lausanne, how we worked with them on one of these paintings. So it's really trying to create one enclosed exhibition space where you could create this sort of ballet of light around one single painting, and really sort of showing a lot of different options to work with this. outfitted the room with motion sensors and put 2 rigs of light very close to the painting, sort of side lighting, and then 1 sort of frontal lighting space. And you could go through about 20 different options of lighting that would change as you would move through the room, and that really helped us focus on specific parts of what makes these paintings powerful. Their sort of reflective capabilities, the details they have in highlighting the specific construction, this type of movements, which I think is very funny because the guys who did this, they're very young and they're definitely of a digital culture age. They're in their early 20s and so on. They really looked at these types of soulage, which is a very organic artistic production. They started making these rays, which is almost like isolating a data stream inside this painting and sort of going through this. It was interesting in terms of aesthetics also. Yes?
This kind of work looks like what's this how can I say it? Like the work is like the raw material for something different, something new that maybe the author maybe could even be on this second.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because it was one sort of very conflictual part with our partner on this first exhibition was a private art foundation who gave us access to some of the paintings, helped source the others, collectors on, and they came with a team of very, very classical art historian curators. Where like when we propose this, and we always propose it as an experiment. We don't say this is the new truth about how you should show paintings. It's always here's another option. They said, oh, no, wait. You're going completely, the will of the author is not respected. You are taking liberties with the material, employing it for something that it should not be, etc., etc. For every single part of this exhibition, there's like 5 labs. It took me about 3 years to push them through. At first it was no, and at the end it was yes. But it took a long time. So there's a lot also of these preconceptions that you have to go through, of sort of the roots of every sort of discipline working with this type of stuff, and also the notion of making an experimental exhibition is really also that you have to push through it, because they were telling me, with all that you're doing here, you are making a statement saying that this is the way things should be. And I was, no. We just show a couple other options how we could show this stuff. And maybe we can say in the end, no, this was a failure. Let's try something else. So this was very, it's very key. And Soulage came to visit the exhibition. So he's 93, everybody was like, okay, maybe he's going to make it, but probably he's going to die before we finish the show. That was really the conversation we were having. And in the end, he made it. And so with a lot of people, obviously, came with him, wheelchair, etc. And all of his helpers were like, maximum 20 minutes in the show. He's tired, not too much input, etc. 2 hours and a half in the show. And everything, he watched everything, he talked with the students, he talked with the researchers, and he basically said, I'm not surprised by anything you did in this show, because it's all elements that I have been consciously working on, but I appreciate that you can reveal it in a more explicit way. And again, without killing the artworks, basically by over-explaining, etc. So it was really a fun conversation actually with him. Just to continue, Luca said we would do a quick break afterwards, so I'll just show you a few more things. It's the same guys, sorry.
Ce que permet notre web app, c'est de voir le relief et de rééclairer la...
Here we have guys also, and this is still the same show, but really going again through the basic digitization process. It's also a big issue of, like, for any type of art and art documentation, of how do you photograph this stuff. And basically, be it now analog or digital, actually the problems are still pretty much the same. You know, how do you do the reference photo of this or that artwork? And this is even more difficult when you have a guy who paints black on black. You know, what is the right light to show it, and how is the right way to avoid that your catalog is filled with just black squares. You know, and so we worked with a lab that does. How do you say, not hyperspectral this time, but just ultra high definition photography, so extremely detailed, the type of stuff that Google also does, where you can zoom in infinitely in a painting until you see this sort of almost canyons of paint. But they also work, the specificity that they do is they shoot a sort of 3D photography. They have a dome, a photographic dome, with about 60 photographic cells, or shooting one after the other, the painting, and these are combined with about the same number of flashes around it. And so you're basically shooting the work in a sort of semicircular way, and then your end photography is a composite of several thousands of images that have been compiled. So for example, for the soulage experiment they did with us, the one photo you see in the show is about 23,000 shots of the painting. And basically, so you have not only a ultra-high rendering of the painting, then you can always debate whether it's the correct rendering, because of course still there's issues of lighting and so on. But then it's also a photo that you can then manipulate to sort of twist around, take the artwork, because it has a sort of 3D component in the photography, so you can go around, you can flip it, you can go into details and turn them around and so on. It was a pretty interesting process that again takes us from raw digitization all the way to how you use this material in an end-user perspective.
Éclairer l'œuvre à volonté et de l'avoir en très haute définition. Il faut numériser l'œuvre d'une façon particulière. C'est pour ça qu'on a développé un système d'acquisition dédié. Il est composé de 58 lampes qui vont s'allumer successivement les unes après les autres, et à chaque fois on va prendre une photo d'une illumination particulière. Ces différentes illuminations vont nous permettre après de reconstruire ce qu'on appelle la réflectance de l'objet, c'est la façon dont il réagit à la lumière, et qui va nous permettre ensuite dans la web application de changer la direction d'éclairage de l'œuvre. Ça c'est virtuel.
Not only can you turn around the painting, but because you shot it with all these different flashes, you can also simulate the light on the painting. You can basically sort of go over that photo and change how the light plays with it, where the light is coming from, what type of light, what intensity, and so on. And of course, this for an artist who says that most of his work is in that relationship with light, suddenly you have a photo that does justice basically to that potential, and that still carries that format. So these guys, for example, now they converted their lab into a startup structure, and they're selling the technology to specific museums for projects, but also they work with, I don't remember if it's Christie's or Sotheby's, with one of the two auction houses, also interested in offering this to their rich potential buyers to have, so that they can have the artworks as demos on their iPads, and that they can really look at them in a very sort of detailed way, instead of always pressing these hugely expensive pre-auction catalogs and so on. So, you know, it's all like, you know, it's poetry in the work, and at the same time there's very sort of basic also business considerations coming into play. And one last thing. Oops, sorry, I'll come back to this later. I have one more video for you. Should be working. Okay. And this is also part of the same exhibition. We have one.
In the autumn of 2016, EPFL opened a new experimental pavilion to bridge art and science. As a part of the inaugural exhibition, different research labs of the university were asked to contribute reactions to the artworks of Pierre Soulage under the theme Noir c'est noir, is black black? These iconic black canvases, or outre noir as the artist calls them, primed the whole exhibition. It is through the interaction of light and matter that these artworks become vividly alive, despite their intense blackness. Imagine taking that blackness away, leaving a completely transparent surface. This is where our installation begins, with a high-resolution 3D scanned, pigmentless outre noir, shifting the focus to light in space.
So these guys are working really only on
this
the light
creates
interaction
intricate light patterns that appear as random and chaotic, and they become visible and alive.
Making a
when
sort of
illuminated
colorless
with
version of the
transparent
painting
surface by a
first.
flashlight.
Then moving on to other demonstrations
However,
of
these refractions
light
don't
and
have
surface
The
interaction.
second object of the installation is designed to create a perfectly circular shadow in the middle of the transparent square. At first, this seems impossible, but looking at the shape of the lens, it makes intuitive sense. The concave shape bends the light away from the center, creating the dark shadow. We call this piece the black hole, an analogy to how a cosmic black hole bends light. But light can also be bent to create more complex patterns. The third object pays homage to the long history of scientific inquiry and advancement in the field of optics research. An illustration of a concave mirror by Leonardo da Vinci is encoded in this transparent plate. Minute details of the drawing and even the handwritten text become visible when illuminated. But when looking at the plate itself, one cannot decipher this image on its surface. This surprising effect is achieved thanks to an advanced computer algorithm developed at EPFL. Through careful calculation of complex light-matter interactions, we can create any light image by shaping transparent material. The last piece, rotating slowly at the end of the room, is the culmination of these light sculptures. As the object turns, a photographic image of two observers in front of an object morphs into shape. The interaction between the art and the observer, mediated by light and space, all come together here. Whereas the large black paintings by Soulage in the room next door come to life in the eye of the observer through interaction of light and space, this series of caustic sculptures pushes this idea to the extreme, splitting the visual motif from the sculpture, only rendering it visible through user interaction.
So here's sort of the goal for us was to say, okay, we have an artist who says the core of the work is with this interaction of light. So we say, okay, let's look at light as information that is convertible information and that is digitally convertible information. So with this in mind, we went to talk to the guys in this lab who work, and it's not very clear from the video, it is sort of very much sort of oriented towards the show. They work on this effect called caustics. And caustics is this deviation effect that you have a glass or a bottle of water on a table and the sun shines through it and you have these patterns forming on the table, or a swimming pool in the sunlight and suddenly you have these wavelets at the surface. When the light hits the surface, bounce at the bottom, bounce back again. So these are all these sort of random patterns generated by light deviation. What these guys do, they sort of retro-calculate this and they say, we start with a very precise image, like this Da Vinci page manuscript that you showed before. We have on the other side a light source that is very precise also, but it doesn't need to be something very complex. It can be just a pocket lamp like in this exhibition. And we're going to work on the middle ground, the sort of black box, the information transformer, basically creating all of the angles of deviation of light that allow us to do this image. So what for example they carve in the plexiglass shapes we saw there, it's not like the Da Vinci shape here, that thing. So you have a very precise image that emerges because of light, but this image is not engraved in the plaque there. If you look at it, it's not like this is what is in there. You look at the plaque and you just see that it's a little bit bumpy, it has weird bounces, etc. The only thing that's really engraved in there are the angles that then allow to create the image. So it's sort of a very special technique, and we said this is interesting because in relationship to the painter, of course, light on a painting is limited to sort of reflection, refraction, everything that's sort of light bouncing back from the object. So let's show this, let's show the potential of this, and let's expand to other notions of light and surfaces and do everything that's sort of diffusion, diffraction, everything of light going through the object, etc. And again, this was interesting for us because it made for a fairly poetic installation in the exhibition, something very playful, aesthetic, and so on. And again, it's sort of a business presentation at the same time, because these guys work now with a lot of different industries using these technologies. For example, with watchmakers, to engrave maybe the top of your watch so that you can check if it's a fake or not, you know, beaming a little light and there's a little image coming through. All of these very sort of, you know, very basic business applications in a way, but it's sort of this combination of works. Enrique before was mentioning all this importance of aesthetics and also poetry in artistic interventions in scientific milieus. So compared to the projects I've shown you up to now, which were really sort of these applied research projects on cultural material, pre-existing cultural material, I'd also just like to show you a couple images and examples of the types of shows we also can do with contemporary artists within this same art lab environment. So for example, this summer we did a 3-month exhibition with a duo of media artists originally from Zurich, currently based in Berlin, called Mediengruppe Bitnik. I noticed that I didn't put the name there, but it's basically the media group Bitnik, so not Beatnik, but B-I-T-Nik, so the sort of digital beatniks. Pretty interesting duo who's been working in and around the internet for about 10 years and really considering all that digital environment of the web as sort of a communicational structure that is always a sort of fighting ground for influence, for power zones and so on, and that is normally also where a large part of the common audience think they almost have no role anymore to play in how this internet is structured. And they always come back on certain specific zones of that communication system and they say, look, this actually is not so complicated in the way that it functions. With the minimum of technical knowledge and coding knowledge, we can actually go back in there and maybe criticize these forms and maybe invert even ways of communicating in them. So for us, this was very interesting to show in the context of our school, where we have a lot of people working on whatever, automated production for the web, digitization of content, etc., etc. Artificial intelligence is used in various domains. It was interesting for us to show this sort of contemporary take and very critical take on the same topics, and have also our scientists interact with this. In this occasion, for example, it was really an artistic proposal that was entirely formulated by the artist with no input from our scientists. It was a sort of summer project that we parachuted in there, but to also get reactions from the scientists. So we invited the bosses of our artificial intelligence labs, machine learning labs, human-computer interaction groups to come and react to this in several public talks, which were pretty interesting. So the way these guys work, I'm just going to go through the artworks very quickly. In this Come Chat With Me exhibition, as we titled it. I'm just going to skip this one. There were a lot of works in there that sort of interrogated several parts of our sort of contemporary technological environment in different ways. One piece that we showed only in documentary form was a sort of document of a performance they did 4 years ago at the Kunsthalle in St. Gallen, also in Switzerland, and it's called the Random Darknet Shopper. Basically, the whole installation consisted of setting up a computer in the exhibition venue and running a program on that computer that was going shopping on the darknet. So on this more protected, more anonymized internet that is of course very often used for gray area, at least, type of transactions, and also often sort of dealing with also completely illegal wares. And the software was basically left to its own sort of, you know, strategies in terms of what it would go and shop. It would make sort of very basic choices, go interact with sellers, using also a very limited sort of vocabulary base, etc., and using a shopping credit of 100 bitcoins per week, or something like that. Basically, the artists took all the production money of the exhibition and gave it as shopping credit to the robot. And so it started going on the web and buying stuff. Started, you know, innocently enough by buying Romanian cigarette boxes that were cheaper than the Swiss ones, that were then shipped to Switzerland. Then started moving into, of course, all of these fake Louis Vuitton bags, sort of hidden surveillance things, like this baseball cap you see in the middle, which is equipped with a secret camera to film people, etc. Fake credit cards, fake keys, etc. And after a while, of course, it started buying drugs also, so it started buying MDMA, started buying small doses of heroin, etc. And everything was shipped to the exhibition venue in Switzerland. This went on for a few weeks, and after 3 or 4 weeks of exhibition, the local police said, guys, you've been getting all this weird stuff in here, and we just have to put a stop on this. So basically the cops showed up, and they arrested the computer, which was making the order. So it became the first computer arrested for illegal doings. Even they had headlines, I didn't copy it here, but the Guardian made an article about it, and really the headline was, Swiss police arrest ecstasy buying robot. And so it was sort of this funny performance about a very serious subject, which is sort of agency and responsibility in artificial intelligence development. If you program a software and you do so by setting patterns that are probably already determined socially or otherwise, you insert prejudices in there, and at a certain point you let that software live its own life. If it goes off the rails at some point, does something reprehensible or completely illegal, who is to be held responsible? And you know, is it the scientist, is it the coder, is it the research institution, the exhibition institution, etc. That's pretty interesting question. So in this occurrence, the computer was released from jail after a couple of weeks once a local judge was able to sort of treat the topic and really decided that, well, in the context of this exhibition and in the context of the public good that the debate of this exhibition represented, the procurement of these sort of shopping items, which were then to be confiscated, was okay. So nobody was charged with anything, etc. But it was an interesting sort of test in a very playful zone, but on a very serious subject. So this was pretty interesting. Then they did several works also with and around Julian Assange and Wikipedia. It was pretty fun. They really played with this sort of absurdity and discrepancy in terms of scale between Assange's digital footprint. He is, you know, through WikiLeaks, he is a massively influential and globally influential digital person, but physically, as you probably all know, he's been locked inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London for about, I think, almost 7 years now, living basically in that room here, which was a one-to-one reproduction. I didn't take photos of the inside, but one-to-one reproduction of his room within the embassy. So the installation consisted in 2 pieces. The first one is called Delivery for Mr. Assange. So the artists were like, okay, this guy is such a, you know, sort of key secret internet person. Probably he gets stuff delivered to him, encrypted files going through half a dozen Tor servers, etc., etc. What actually happens if we go old school communicating with a guy like this and we just send him a package through the British mail and see if it arrives at the embassy, if a person of interest like this actually is able to get the package, and what sort of surveillance filters the package also goes through. So they did this little package for him, equipped with a small camera hidden with a tiny hole and a GPS sensor. And so they sent the package from London to London, and the package was tweeting information out to a dedicated Twitter account. That was over the course of the voyage of the package, followed by a few thousand people who were encouraging the package to get to Assange. And it finally got there. This is him receiving the package, and but it was funny because it went through. Apparently they didn't detect the camera and the sensor, but still it went through, of course, a lot of distribution offices, which showed you the sort of absurdities of postal patterns these days. You know, you ship it there, and then it comes back here, and it goes through 3 different cities before coming back to the same city to be delivered. And it went through a couple of police stations to be checked, etc. It was a pretty sort of interesting sort of way of showing a sort of, you know, again, a sort of very surveilled communication infrastructure in a way. And then the room itself is really also part of the interest, is also that when you step into that room, you are in a way hijacked inside the embassy. Everything on your phone that is location services based switches to the location of the embassy in London. So suddenly Google thinks you are in the Ecuadorian embassy and you are sort of hanging out with Assange, which is a nice way to, you know, go and keep him company in his sort of seclusion. So this was an interesting piece too. And then the centerpiece of the exhibition was this this piece here that we did in a co-production with the Cultural Swiss Center in Paris and my old office in San Francisco, SwissNext. And it's really behind this sort of forest of CAPTCHA writings done in neon, so these writings that you have to go through to prove that you're not a bot on the internet. Then you come to this installation with these 50 female portraits looking at you and actually also talking to you. And this installation is really there to probe the relationships we have among humans, between humans and bots, and also between bots and bots on the internet today. The internet today is, for more than half of it, is an automated creation. Half of what you read, half of whatever, all the transaction systems, etc. It's all automatically created, and up to, of course, now also newspaper articles, etc. A lot of automated content. And so they wanted to probe where, up to where that limit went of dealing with bots and maybe also not knowing it. And one very interesting area to deal with this is online dating, because dating, generally you still expect, for most of us, to be dealing with another human, physical person. And so they dealt here with, maybe you remember the story of that dating website, Canadian dating website called Ashley Madison, which sort of existed since, I think, 2009, 2010. Very explicit motto: life is short, have an affair. So it was oriented mostly towards married people who wanted to have a quick fling on the side, etc. It was not a dating website that was dedicated to finding the love of your life after 3 or 5 coffee dates. It was very explicitly oriented towards extramarital sex. And because it was so explicit, it was also a fully paying model. Most of these websites, you get a free ride for super long, etc. This one, as soon as you wanted to talk to someone, $10 conversation credit, $20 conversation credit, you want to put the photo, another $5, etc., etc. So very sort of financially intensively demanding model for the customers. And the customers, there were a lot of them, 32 million active users, but almost all of these 32 million customers, they were males. And there were almost no females using this website. This was all shown because a group of hackers hacked the database of the website and released all of the codes constructing the website, all of the user profiles and so on in 2014-15. So of course, there were the little scandals were that, of course, a lot of guys had signed up with their Nestle email addresses and their, Chilean government email addresses. So of course, this was the tiny scandal. But then the most interesting things was that this was a website running on basically artificially entertaining almost exclusively male clientele. So more or less 32 million male users and a few thousand females, not even, just no interest. So the website had this problem that they had all these paying customers.
Where you can find that information right now?
About this case?
Yeah.
Just Google Ashley Madison leaks, and you'll have a few things. There's a couple science reporters in the US who sort of brought that to, they were the first to...
and I can find them.
Yeah, I'll look it up afterwards and I can give you the name of the journalist. There was one specific journalist who took up contact with the hackers and said, okay, can we look at this database together? And that's where they found that basically to entertain all that male clientele, that there were no real women
yeah, it's
to...
just like it's not that easy to say that females are not interested in have extramarital relationships.
No. But the website is,
just why they were not.
Yeah. No, it was definitely sort of a pitch of the website. No, no judgment beyond that. It's like it was really sort of the thing. Just their thing didn't attract apparently female users. So what the website then had to do basically to entertain all of this paying male clientele was to set up this automated system where you had a mother bot analyzing peaks in demands and saying, oh, there's 100 users more in Santiago and 500 more in San Francisco. We have to create some ladies to entertain that clientele. And then that mother bot would say, okay, we need 50 more women in San Francisco, automated creation of profiles, take a random photo, steal it from the web, put a little Venetian mask like these girls here have on top, assign an address because you needed some sort of geolocation, so also sort of choosing sort of hotspots in the city where you're at. The bots living near Lausanne, they all had addresses basically in sort of shopping centers or things like that, just because that's what the programs would land on when they were looking for heavily trafficked areas. And also assign some of these random sort of, internet profile names, whatever, Ashley81B, etc., etc. And to generate conversations with the users, the bots were all relying on the same database of maybe 100 pickup lines that were really North American pickup lines. So all of these sort of typical expressions, or like picking up a conversation, etc. And then these were translated in a lot of different languages, but pretty roughly. So it sounded like really weird, and you would get these like weird messages from girl, and then nothing for a week, and then suddenly you would come back with another unrelated message, etc. And so the artists sort of probe this, and every time they do this piece, they do another search in the archive, and they say, okay, for example, here we were in Lausanne, they did a search in a sort of, Lausanne is not that dense, fairly small city, they did a search in a larger radius, 50 kilometers around Lausanne, about, like, I think 25,000 active real users, talking to 117 bots in the same area. And then we tried to we didn't have 117 screens, but we took 50 of these female bots and we incarnated them. And this is the only place you would ever get to meet them and to sort of enter in a conversation with them. Conversation that was as empty as it was on the website, because basically they were just sort of taking that database of pickup lines and sort of lining out the words and say, hi, you're cute, etc. I'm really desperate this week, or something like that. And sort of these words would sort of pile up until you had the 50 sort of screens talking to you at the same time, etc. It was a pretty interesting concept and process. And what was also fun to see is that this was definitely to expose a completely automated process, but still pretty much 1 out of 2 visitors I had at the show would go and look at these screens and spend time sort of looking at the project and sort of turning around the screens and say, oh, but it's interactive, right? She is following me, and they really talk to me, etc. Whereas these CGI constructions, they're as cold as possible. They just blink a little bit, and they have these very monochord voices, etc. But still, there's this sort of magical fascination with technology again, where it had to be interactive. There had to be something. So the visitors were all coming back and saying, "This one, she follows me," and then it's a very, very bizarre sort of set of interfaces. And so again, this is sort of, questions that in a school like ours we're going to come back on through scientific work. Also, these same critical and ethical questions that are going to emerge through the scientific work itself. So it's good also to have these artists sort of asking the questions a little bit in advance, actually, compared to the types of reflections we have, which are more sort of applied, and we try to make it function, and then we ask the why and the how a little bit after. So. Any questions on this? Yeah. And then the next show we're going to do, which opens in about 3 weeks, is basically we take this same space and we convert it into a thought factory, where we work with some neuroscience labs in the school working on brain-computer interfaces. With one of the prevalent tools in that domain today being these EEG headsets, the electroencephalographic headsets, that are able to record some of the electrical signals of your brain to then potentially convert them into another format of data that is analyzable. So it's used in medical situations, of course, first, to sort of see how the brain triggers certain movements, and maybe to reinstate these movements for handicapped or injured medical clientele. But it's also, for us, what we are going to do is basically that we're going to use these EEG headsets to enable visitors to activate these sort of big industrial machines that have mechanisms reminiscent of the early 19th century sort of basic mechanical setups that allowed the creation of the first factories and the first big wave of work automation. And so it's all a conflagration between this first industrial revolution with these symbols and the fourth, the current one, the digital revolution, which with these EEG headsets that are totally this, it's basically converting really physical information into digital data that can be activated in another context, in another set of commands and so on. And really sort of saying, well, between these two epochs we have again the same questions about the potentials of work automation, the dangers in particular to humans and their place in the workplace and in society beyond that. Did we sufficiently upgrade ourselves to still have a role to play, etc. So we'll see what this gives. It's an experiment on several levels. There's a part of conceptual experiment, and at the same time we're back also to that practical applied research component, just saying, are these EEG headsets, which are fairly complex tools, and here we're really talking medical grade headsets, not the gadget ones you can buy now for $100, are these tools slowly getting towards a standardized level where you can actually use them for interactive setups in exhibitions and other public programs. This is sort of what we work on now. Well, that's all I have in terms of projects to discuss today. I think sort of you know, to keep in mind is sort of the work we do in terms of existing heritage at these, you know, 3 levels along that software chain, what we discussed earlier today, and that integration really in a sort of research, education, tech transfer in the school at EPFL. And also this sort of model, setting this up like this, with the exhibition venue being both a place for debate of art and technology interfaces and a place of test for digitization and exhibition technologies. It's a sort of new model within all of these experimental art science models and art technology models emerging. There's several other ones that basically, you know, you could take in consideration. Of course, there's museums working directly with highly specialized design companies to realize specific setups. So typically, everything that the local projects did with the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Gallery One, that's sort of a fundamental thing. Affiliating visitors, maybe have to come back on this later. There's these museum integrated labs, typically the work the Louvre did with Dai Nippon Publishing, the Japanese sort of printing technology company, isolating specific issues for the museum, treating them in a sort of museum lab in Tokyo, and then trying to bring back the research in the actual exhibition spaces of the Louvre. There's the very sort of exclusive technological partnerships between museums and one tech provider. Samsung is pretty big in this. One example is the work they do with the British Museum, where they help set up the British Museum's Education Center, where all the digital tools available are Samsung tools, and you try to sort of, from that infrastructure, build mediation tools for a specific audience, but an audience that from their little playground then also goes and visits the rest of the museum. So you bank on that little starting point to then sort of extend in the whole building and in the rest of the audience. Several others sort of really experimental structures that were conceived as an integral part of the museum, so really as part of our work with the conservators and so forth. We had this structure in Lyon for the new Musée des Confluences in Lyon, Erasme, that in the end didn't work out and was wiped out in the last minute of the development plans of the museums, because everybody thought, well, no, it doesn't make sense, we don't want to waste square meters on experimental lab spaces, we have to show our content to our paying audience immediately, they don't want to be part of a research process. This was interesting too. Skip that. One very interesting aspect for us also is all these structures related to museum institutions that are basically modeling themselves on the startup incubator model. So the new museum in New York was a pioneer with this, opening this new Inc. Incubator right next to the actual museum in 2013-14, and you go in that sort of warehouse building right next to the nice Sanaa Museum, and it's basically your typical startup setup with people hanging out there, working long hours, pretty much living there, and developing stuff that is actually then applied directly in the galleries next door, etc. So these are all models that for us are interesting reference points, but we also think that with that structure of having research development that really takes into account developing transdisciplinarity on the campus itself, and then having a physical exhibition space that acts as an extended test zone, an extension of the research infrastructure of the school, we can offer something that brings a little plus in terms of these art science, basically interactions in these types of sites. Voilà. So that's sort of what I wanted to present today. I think maybe some of you haven't seen the first 2 hours we did today, but voila, from this, do you have any specific questions for me? Any sort of, also based on your experience in Chile, also what you see maybe that is interesting in there or very different and so on? Feel free to go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I want to ask if you work also in Switzerland with the science center. For example, one artist that I invite here, Italian artist, they did a documentary about the Affective Science Center in Geneva.
Yes.
And so it was interesting because it was questioning the link between artificial AI and then robotic application. And I wonder if in your center also do some project with this kind of
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So we have now more and more, we have a sort of core of scientists within the campus that we are working with prioritarily in terms of developing the full program, and these are the professors that are put in this field of digital humanities. Now we have about 4 professors, 4 or 5 now in that field, and these are our main guys. But then starting working with them on a program, then we say, well, and again, still sort of thinking along that software chain, along the way you're going to have questions that are about artificial intelligence. Typically our Venice Time Machine project, we also use artificial intelligence bots to, for example, sort all the images of Venice we digitize, and they assign them to specific locations in the city, etc. So again, you have a portrait of the city that will emerge that is largely determined by automated processes. And then this again brings you back to that notion that the beatniks, for example, were treating with sort of this automated creation of a reality or non-reality, where it's going to be harder and harder to distinguish what is really there or not. So for us, it's always sort of having our sort of small curatorial team, our small core of labs that we work with anyways, and with them, based on the themes we approach, say, okay, here we need a more purely technical help on the project. And maybe even through getting that specifically technical help, they will actually bring questions that we haven't asked yet that are more of an ethical or critical type of state. And that's what we see typically also with these digitization processes around, for example, the soulage pieces we saw before. We had a lot of discussions with the labs themselves and with the art historians working with us on the exhibition about the notion of a true representation, which were completely different depending on the domain you were coming from. And so the notion of exactness, of truth, the need for these concepts or not, these are super interesting topics. So for us, we always try to bounce back between all that stuff.
So this is the new museum, right?
Yeah, I was just showing this last, just sort of comparing other initiatives that are interesting for us. The new museum, they basically built a startup incubator related to the museum called New Inc., which is very much people who, businesses who get selected to be in there. It's the same process as in any of these incubators, What is your idea? What is your business plan to make it happen? What are the funds you already have, etc.? You get this type of evaluation, and then you get support in terms of maybe a financial kick and privileged access to facilities where you're going to meet other tech-oriented people who might help your business, where you get access to possible funders, and in this case also you get a pretty consequent test ground also for your experiments. Of course, again, it's not an easy process, and it's not like every startup that is in this building can just walk over and ask the curator, Massimiliano Gioni, hey, I want to do something in the next exhibition. You know, it doesn't work like this, so it's a more sort of long process of really integrating things. And yeah.
I was wondering on the example of Venice.
Yep.
If you got some more than documenting and presenting or accessing, if you got a more maybe ambitious view on what could happen with a repository like that.
Yeah.
In terms of reinterpreting the history.
Yeah. So history interpretation is definitely one thing with this. Because the thing that's common to a lot of these projects, the sort of common setup is to say, suddenly you'll get,
le passé.
Oops. You know, as you sort of go through that. As you go through this archive and you add to what's available basically to you as documentation, starting with what's available to specialists who, as is mentioned at some point in these videos, were also making their work and maybe their assumption about how history really happened based on a limited set of documents, suddenly going through with this sort of massive flow through the archive are going to emerge documents that will complete or even contest the views they had on their research, and it's going to allow them to go through the process again with much more information, with tools that help you search through this information. And it's also going to, hopefully, but we have to be careful also with that, hopefully democratize history to a certain point by giving all that massive information, making it accessible to a much broader scope of people. But then the thing is, and we get this question very often, is like, okay, but so now you're going to rewrite history with algorithms, basically. And it's computers who are going to tell us why this and that happened and what was the sense of that revolution and that other one. Probably what's going to happen is more than a new narrative, you're going to have this multiplicity of narratives where we'll say, look, you have to look at this situation again and consider it as this is an option, this is an option, this is an option. And from there, either you take this as a positive and you say, well, we'll never know, or that you say, well, this relativism is also dangerous because it opens us to sort of no critical standpoint on anything that happened because maybe that was not the way, etc. So there's a risk, even the leader of that project, he says, in a way, yes, we are entering an age of the constant fake, and the sort of fake news is only sort of one small first manifestation of this, where at some point you're not going to be able to trust much, in terms of the reality of what's shown to you. Is this historical phenomenon, was it constructed? Is this image photoshopped? Is, etc. And sort of the only way to basically also counteract this effect is to build on education, basically, and to say, okay, if there are all these tools out there that help us, treat the past, but also possibly modify and falsify it, the more you have people on the other side who have studied the same technologies and know how it works and maybe know how to deconstruct something that's offered to you, then again you're better off. And this is why we want to develop also these students who have a knowledge of technology, of coding and so on, but who also have a knowledge of history and of the way history was constructed so far.